This is Lisa Miller, and I'm the host of the Healthcare Leadership Experience. Today's episode is sponsored by Invoice ROI, the only patented purchase services technology to manage, monitor, and benchmark invoice line item details. Invoice ROI allows hospitals to rapidly get to the details of their spend without any manual work and to achieve cost savings in days, not weeks, months, or even years. Today, our guest is Curtis Brooks, and we will be talking about positioning your internal business case. Curtis is the principal and practice director of the Magis Group. Curtis has a highly specialized practice helping organizations think differently about engaging C-suite executives. He has a client list that includes some of the biggest names in enterprise sales, and of late, many startups and smaller firms who have to incorporate persuasive techniques in their sales presentations, business cases, or investor pitches. On today's podcast, we will be discussing how to successfully create an internal business case. Every organization has the need for their employees to create business cases, from new strategic initiatives to merger and acquisitions, and for large purchases. Curtis will talk about the common mistakes that are made when putting together a business case and why it's so important to utilize a framework when putting together your business case. You can meet Curtis on LinkedIn, Curtis Brooks on LinkedIn, or email him at cbrooks@themagisgroup.com, MAGIS group.com. If you'd like to learn more about Vi Healthcare, please go to our website, vihealthcare.com, and schedule a call with me to learn how we can support and accelerate your purchase services, margin improvement, and cost savings goals. Now let's get started.
Welcome to the Healthcare Leadership Experience, a place where healthcare leaders will share proven strategies and innovative approaches to leading the clinical and business side of healthcare. This show is sponsored by Vi Healthcare Consulting, who has proudly helped hospitals save over $700 million in non-labor costs since 1999. Here's your host, Lisa Miller, founder and CEO of Vi Healthcare.
Welcome, Curtis. I'm so excited to have you on the Healthcare Leadership Experience and to have our discussion today about business cases. So welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be a part of this series, and I'm really excited. I've enjoyed our work together, so I think this is going to be a great conversation.
Yeah. So we've had the fun and hard work. There's always some more hard work there of you helping me and Vi and in how we communicate, how we really present what we do for our clients. And I've enjoyed our work. I've learned so much. And I really like the audience to get a little bit of background. You know, we are talking about internal business cases and how we construct those. And, you know, if you could give everybody just some background on a little about you and your methodology and about really just our conversation today about building a high-performing business case that's really effective.
Thanks, Lisa. So my work with clients has really been focused on building the business case from the outside in. As you sort of said in your opening, my focus really has been in the B2B space with organizations that have a mandate to engage a very senior audience. And of course, what we're talking about today is the internal case where you have managers, senior managers, directors, vice presidents, what have you. They have to present their case to seniority, maybe a CFO, the CEO, or even the board. So, for me, I'm fortunate enough to have the opportunity to see a couple dozen of these types of presentations a week in the work that I do. And I think what's ironic is everyone makes the same mistakes. And through that, there are nearly identical success factors in building a business case that is persuasive and motivates the stakeholders to action. So you and I were having this conversation a few days ago, and I made the point that I recently heard a senior executive say he's never seen a bad business case. That was really profound to me because in essence, it's all relative. So then the question is, how does one business case stand out from another? And how can you get your request prioritized and to the top of the list? And what's complicated this, of course, is the pandemic. And as we've talked, budgets have been hard hit and The operating climate has a lot of uncertainty. Chief buyers are more involved in investment decisions, and it just has this crazy, unprecedented level of spend scrutiny going on. And what was once these routine decisions now have potentially significant implications for the near and long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made a point earlier about these internal business cases or anywhere in the organization. And so one of the goals of having this podcast was to bring experts and thought leaders outside of healthcare, as well as people that are within healthcare. And the reason why I thought it was going to be so insightful for you to come on the show, even though you're helping us as a healthcare organization, but primarily your work is B2B. But I just saw so much value in helping hospitals and health systems with their internal business cases. And that could be anywhere from presenting to their board or presenting to the C-suite, or even your value analysis committee. These value analysis committees have to present to physicians or clinicians. And there is such a structure and a usefulness. And I think you're going to start to really unfold that. But there's so much, like you said, so much happening now. And these decisions, have to be made with a different level of thinking, right?
Yeah.
So, I'd really like to hear more. I have a little bit of an insight of what you're going to get to, but I'm going to tease the audience a little bit about PowerPoint gets a lot of criticism, but it shouldn't. And I just, I don't know if you're there yet, but I'm looking forward to hearing how you unpack that.
Well, yeah. So and obviously in an internal business case, the formats can vary widely, and only because, of course, for the obvious, it's internal, and some people feel as though it's more efficient to just put and position their business case into a Word document or some type of report. But you're right. I mean, it's PowerPoint as a medium really does get so much criticism. But really, when you think about it, it allows people to collaborate and negotiate, meaning because it's both visual and modular at the same time. So reading time is at a premium. So visual documents written in sort of a summation type writing style are replacing the rambling text documents. And that forces you to stage the argument incrementally. You want control in the presentation, and control really, as I tell my clients all the time, control is really about controlling yourself. And for that reason, PowerPoint is the best format for ensuring you don't get ahead of yourself. So as we talk about these common mistakes, and I provide some recommendations on what to do differently, recognize that I'm looking at it through the medium of PowerPoint, and I'm not sure how much it applies to some of the other mediums.
In our work together, you really have taught me and how to be very, like you said, controlled or disciplined in how we work with our clients. And learning that approach has had such an enormous impact just on how I communicate. And like you said, it's control, but it's controlling me. and so that I could share a message, and I can, share our findings or any kind of communication in a very effective way. And I believe that what you're going to speak about now is really what is that format? What is that methodology that really creates a strong internal business case?
Yeah, so let's transition then from the lens of PowerPoint to those common mistakes that I alluded to earlier. And I will just comment on them one at a time. But I'd say the first is really this idea that business cases should be structured around a problem statement or a need, solution, impact approach. I mean, I see this all the time. For example, if someone is recommending a new way to perhaps improve an accounts payable processing procedure, they'll start out by saying the current procedure involves 15 manual steps, and the time it takes means we're losing discounts as a result of that particular need. So then they'll transition into what they're proposing, a new system that will do everything from stored data and do the documentation and automate. And then they, of course, punctuated with this whole comment about here's how we get it deployed. Here's when we can see some type of return. Here's how the new technology is going to impact the manual aspect of what we do, and here's how we'll recoup our investment. So it always generally starts with some sort of problem or problem statement. And I would highly recommend that you look at sort of resequencing that pitch or that argument in the business case. And I think one of the keys is to ensuring that business case is persuasive is really to establish context. Now, that seems rather straightforward and simple. And while we understand that context is important, we generally fail to deliberately choose a context because we believe that the context of the recommendation is obvious. So what I always try to communicate to my clients that context is really so important to any communication, particularly in business case settings, because it provides a place for people and ideas to come together. So what I mean by that is if we take the points I made earlier in the outline of a typical problem statement of a business case, the one that starts with a problem statement, and then you shift it to one that has context. The way you might start that is suggesting that, well, first, the current operating climate, new competitors, and increasing regulatory pressures are forcing us to enhance the customer experience. And the evidence suggests that our back office can play a role in preparing us for the future. Then, and only then, do you start transitioning to that commentary about what the real problem is in the processing procedure.
Yeah. So Curtis, I love this point, and I just want to sit on it just for a minute because it is a habit, or just I don't know why that is that we would launch right into the problem. The problem is we don't have enough time or resources, and just we focus on the problem when looking at this big picture view or the vision. It is just, I think, is a very key aspect of putting together a business case, because you said it earlier, these decisions are so important now, and there's probably so many more of these business cases being made in hospitals, like your example, whether it's a new accounts payable automation system, or if it's a new technology or new IT or a system, whatever it is, formulating this business case with a big picture view is just, I think it's so important, right? Because it shifts it to, I think you and I have spoken about it, it's inspirational and it aligns stakeholders.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, really, if your recommendation or idea exists without a foundation, then it's isolated. And that isolation limits its potential. There's an author, a fellow by the name of Lee Lefevre. He's got a great analogy when he talks about this whole comment of, you've heard the phrase of you're missing the forest for the trees. Well, what he says in explaining context is it means that you are so focused on the detail that you're missing the big picture. And the trees are great and can be very helpful, but information about the forest is really what makes them useful. So the idea is to start your business case by really creating a sense of agreement. When you started with that big picture, you get heads nodding. And the most elegant way to approach that is really to take the advice of someone like a Simon Sinek, a great marketer, who says, start with why. And that why is almost most often the big picture. And as you said, it's more inspirational, but at the same time, when you eventually convert that business case into a project plan, assuming it's approved, of course, with milestones, then you can ensure that there's alignment of all the key stakeholders.
Yeah, that's just, it's just brilliant. And I have now really, as I'm presenting or we're putting together our findings reports or anything we're doing, that just that shift, it makes a big difference. So can you continue? I know you've got a...
Yeah, so a couple of others. I'd say the second big real common mistake is, I see most presenters, they use a very logically sound argument, but it's persuasively very poor. And in other words, they present the facts, but they're not really sure how to persuade. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that really the best way to persuade is to let your audience discover their own reasons. In other words, persuade themselves. Instead of sort of coming out and telling the audience the answer directly, let them have a role in the story. In other words, what you're trying to do, you're not really persuading, you're getting people to persuade themselves, such that when they get to the answer isn't just any answer or the recommendation, it's their recommendation. And what I always like to see in my clients' pitch in the B2B environment is you want the customer to reach the preferred conclusion before you actually introduce it in your presentation. And it inspires the customer to discover their own reasons for that change or recommendation or selection. But most importantly, what that does is they trust it more. So I would recommend that rather than thinking about a structure that is oriented around just the facts and the logic, get to a point where you're getting some agreement from those customers about what the best practices are, what the critical success factors are. And once they've acknowledged those, then highlight your recommendation and how it aligns to it.
Right. Can maybe help our audience at this point, because this is the real thinking behind building this business case, right? So they've got to, think, well, what are those success factors? Let's say the success factors needed if we're going to engage physicians, or we're going to agree upon a potential merger or present to the board. So can you just talk through a little bit about, just give an example or two?
Yeah, well, I would think those success factors, the easiest way to get to it is really to put them in the context of what is a best practice or what is a critical success factor. And what you're actually doing is using the narrative and the language that's associated with your recommendation when you set up that best practice or critical success factor.
That's right. You're building it from where you see the benefit of the business case. So that's just for clarity, because, for me, once I got this point, it really was really transformative. So the person building the business case has specific reasons or has a vision, but they're building these themselves as success factors. Is that correct?
That's correct. And what they're really doing is setting up their presentation to invite agreement before the recommendation. So if you invite agreement and you gain agreement in those best practices or critical success factors, then it's going to be much easier to transition to how your recommendation aligns to it.
Right. So that business case will have, these are the critical success factors, these are best practices. And then as you're moving through the business case, heads are nodding and everyone's in agreement as you move towards, like you said, that recommendation. And so I think, again, a really important point is a shift, because the person thinking about this business case has to start, creating that. So they gain alignment. They gain, like you said, I love the people are discovering their own reasons, but really it's a planned process, right? It's a format.
Precisely right. You're essentially getting them to persuade themselves.
That's right.
Which obviously creates some efficiencies in the overall process.
That's right. And so I just want to take a step back for a minute. So, maybe if someone's thinking, well, that's a really sophisticated, or you're almost playing chess, right? But you could see it that way. But I think what we're trying to do here, remember, this is an internal business case. Someone in the hospital is saying, look, we need to buy this, or we need to merge, or we need to make this decision on strategy. And so if this initiative is so important, well, you're going to want to put this effort in and rethink an approach so that it is successful, it does get approved. And I want to make sure that, in the context of this business case, you want to put that kind of thinking and effort in, because it's an important initiative. And so if it's so important, you want to lead with a big picture view. You want to start building out what are those best practices and to gain alignment, because this is meaningful to the hospital.
Yeah, and one clever way to position it might be to stage it in a world-class context. So if you can get your audience to agree on some critical success factors or what is world-class, Then once they agree to it, you just have to ensure that your recommendation aligns to those attributes. And it just creates so much efficiency in ensuring that you get agreement from your audience.
So, when you say you use PowerPoint and you use PowerPoint in a very unique way, there is written text, but you format your PowerPoint in a very logical way. So there's sentences, you have images, but I would encourage those listening to reach out to Curtis. I'll give you a way to reach out to Curtis at the end of the show. But he's got a brilliant way how he formulates PowerPoint so that it's. Can you just talk a little bit about the titles? Because I know we're shifting a little bit, but I think it's important because, people think of PowerPoint, they're thinking lots and lots of pictures and one word or two words. The way you structure your PowerPoints and those pages is your own format. Can you just talk a little bit about it before we go into?
Yeah, so that's actually a good segue because the structure of the presentation is extremely important in the aesthetics and so on and so forth. It's a segue toward the comment I was going to make around one common mistake is that there's this idea that the presentation has to be very crisp and concise. And we've all heard that. Make it short, make it direct, make it hit the key points immediately. But what I always communicate to my clients and I recommend it's not about how long the presentation is, i.e. the number of slides. It's about how long it feels. And so you can, in essence, have a 5-page PowerPoint presentation that feels like 40 pages and 40 minutes. But you can also have a 40-page presentation that feels like 5 minutes. And it really points to how you structure the content in each slide and then how you narrate that content. So I am asked all the time, what does a great presentation look like? And when I get that request from someone or that question from someone, what I generally do is show them an outline of the slides, not the actual PowerPoint, but an outline of the slides, the headlines, and how they're organized. That generally exposes where the real flaws are. And when you convert that sort of PowerPoint to a Word outline, you can review it for flow and clarity. And one of the errors that I typically see is that the narrative, the headline narrative, there's generally a disconnect between what the presenter intended to say and what the headline narrative says. So one way to fix that, this is the point you were making a few minutes ago, one way to fix that is to ensure that your headline narrative has full sentence headlines. And that forces a discipline on your ideas and how you communicate. When you are focused on creating a headline narrative that is associated with the key takeaway of the visual on each slide. It sounds simple, but once you go through that exercise, mental exercise, and then actually put it to paper, it becomes really challenging. But if you can make it work, if you can synchronize that full sentence headline with the graphic or the illustration or the aesthetic, it makes a huge difference in the flow and the clarity. Then you'll find that perhaps a 20-page PowerPoint presentation feels shorter than a 5-page presentation, only because you've got the right sort of narrative and flow associated with it.
Yeah, and I also feel like when you're looking at that page and you have a 2 or 3 words, it's a summary that maybe makes sense to you, or I can speak for myself. Sometimes when I'm putting together a presentation, I know what I mean and I put it in up top and it's summarized. Other people won't have that same thought or context. And now, I'm always putting that full sentence, and it's easier for them to understand. It's easier for them to, pull everything together. No one's guessing or like, what does she mean by that? Versus I have a sentence and it's clear. But that's thanks to you.
Well, that's precisely right. And, there's a lot of research. It's fascinating. There's a lot of research on the impact that full sentence headlines make. And so part of the impact is it is the one aspect of any presentation that makes it more memorable. And that's fascinating because most people will say, well, what makes a presentation memorable? The visual, the aesthetics, the way it looks, the presenter, maybe some humor or what have you. But ironically, what is most memorable in a presentation is that headline narrative and whether or not you have structured in a full sentence to communicate the key takeaway from that slide.
Yeah, I think there's probably going to be a dozen plus important points that people are going to take away from this show, but that one is definitely a big one. It's just this thinking through your business case, putting it into PowerPoint and having that clarity and, putting that full sentence key takeaway up top on the PowerPoints is very, very important, right?
Extremely important, of course, in this climate, right? Because you're presenting in formats that are awkward for everyone, whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Meeting or what have you. And you've got an audience staring at a slide. So you're presenting your business case and you've got an audience who might be focused on an illustration or a visual, but their eye is going to take them to that headline narrative. And if the headline narrative has the key takeaway, it's going to make a huge impact into how they retain that information.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the world we live in now, right? Is virtual and Zoom and how we have to think about how we present.
Yeah. And the last point I'll make in terms of common mistakes is usually in a recommendation, what I typically see is someone will outline a menu of the specific attributes of their recommendation and why those attributes or characteristics are important. But I would recommend that you try to avoid that format because really what it does is it sets up a comparative exercise on these specific attributes. And it's actually not particularly memorable. So instead, what I try to suggest to my clients is they visualize a Venn diagram. And rather than just outline a menu of capabilities, they think about the combination of those capabilities and the attributes, how those work together, and then they position their recommendation around the intersection. And that is a very powerful way to run interference on what are almost always a set of inconsequential objections. And you and I have talked about what an inconsequential objection sounds like. And I got to imagine that they emerge in a business case presentation or a business case document. If you can package those attributes and those characteristics of whatever your recommendation is in a way that highlights a combination of how they come together and how they work together, and then that intersection, of course, becomes your recommendation, it really helps on a persuasive level.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts. And somebody yesterday, I was having a conversation and they said, oh, well, the reason why, they chose you for a project was because of X. And I'm like, yes, but no. It was, and now because of Curtis, I'm like, no, it's the combination of 1, 2, and 3 is the reason why we were chosen, not one. And but it happens to be the truth. I don't really believe that it's ever this one reason. But in this context, I kind of wanted to have a discussion with you about it because maybe give an example. So let's say a hospital is looking to buy a large piece of equipment for the OR. And like you said, all these attributes, they can list all the attributes versus creating like a Venn diagram that says, this will lead us to be able to be known regionally for innovative care. It'll align the physicians, or you're probably better. Of course, you are better at this than I am. But I think talking about those 3 reasons as it has to be an intersection in order for this to be successful. It's not any 1 or 2. It's the intersection of 3 or 4.
That's exactly right. And in the B2B world, that's where we create differentiation. In the business case world, that's where I think your recommendation can become most powerful. Again, the goal is to run interference on a set of objections that really don't challenge the business case, right? Or the ROI. And in that way, you are ensuring that you're gaining some agreement that, yes, the combination of these attributes is going to be critical for us. And that's why you're making that specific recommendation.
Right. So in the case of starting a new project, the benefits of the proposed business change, those you're putting that together, for those reasons, right? And I didn't ask this before, but maybe for those who reach out to you, I think you would show, some examples on this format, on your business
Absolutely.
format. And unfortunately, unlike a webinar, we could show some of this, but on a podcast, we can't. But there's a methodology, communication, whether it's, verbal communication or particularly these presentations for business cases, there's a successful way to put these together. And you have a methodology, Curtis, that organizations use globally, and from the top brand name businesses throughout the world, they're using your methodology. And this methodology is able to communicate ideas, vision, strategy. I mean, it works. It really does. And I still have I meant like one more question before you go, but I really encourage those that are listening to the show, if you have a business case, some of these, as you're putting together your strategy or you've got to make a presentation internally at your hospital, I'd encourage you to reach out to Curtis. He does great work, whether it's one-on-one or he does some virtual training, but he not only has a proven brilliant methodology, also cares, and he cares about the success of his client. And that really matters. So
thank you.
Curtis, you're welcome. So if, as we're, kind of wrapping up, could you, maybe think of or give our audience maybe one or two more tips? You've given out so much information. I saw your prep and it's extraordinary. You put, there's a lot of strategies given us today, but maybe like one last one or two.
Well, I would say it's less of a tip and more about the outcome of building this correctly. And often folks tend to miss this. It's that these presentations, and it's particularly in today's climate, they really have to have a life of their own. And so much of the selling, and with my clients, the B2B selling, is now done absent the sales team's ability to engage the client live. So their documents, their assets, those artifacts have to sell themselves in their absence. So some of these suggestions or recommendations I'm providing are going to really help your audience achieve that, because they need to ensure that when that document is passed along, distributed internally, that whether it's a very senior executive or the CEO or the board, they can read it and consume it without the verbal narration that is typically required or associated with those documents. And whether it's everything from the headline narratives to the way in which you package that set of capabilities, or even how you arrange those critical success factors to get them to persuade themselves. It's so important that you ensure that the document has a life of its own. I like to phrase it with my clients. We call it the self-driving presentation or the autonomous presentation, right? Because it really needs to have that capability in today's climate, more so now than ever.
I love that, autonomous, but it's true, right? So you want to be able to have a business case that can sit independent and be reviewed, and someone's able to do what you spoke about today, which is create the big picture, the vision, put together those critical success factors in a way that's understood, that gets them buy-in and alignment, and really shows that there's the intersection of those attributes are put together in such a way that the business case, it works itself or is elevated to the point of, that decision does get made, right? Or it moves that along further. So it does need to be autonomous. Curtis, thank you for that last part, because I think that's important too. Sometimes we pick up some of those presentations and you're looking and you're like, I don't know what we're looking at.
Yeah,
Or
definitely.
you get the Word document, that's 10 pages or a book. And I think that that's also something that may not get read as thoroughly as what you've put together, which is, again, your methodology on creating a presentation that really does achieve the outcomes. So, Curtis, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Lisa.
And can you just give everyone your email, please?
Yeah, so it's Curtis Brooks on LinkedIn, of course. That's one way to connect with me. The other is through my business email address. It's cbrooks, first initial C, Brooks, cbrooks at themagisgroup.com, THEMAGIS.com. Look forward to having a conversation with someone if they're interested in learning more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage everyone to reach out to Curtis with your communication, written business case needs, and even just for your teams, and as they need training. This is a spectacular way to help communicate your strategy and goals in your organization. Curtis, thank you. I look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Healthcare Leadership Experience. If you enjoyed today's show, please leave us a review. Your reviews help other healthcare leaders find this podcast and see the value that it provides. If you're a healthcare leader who would like to be on the show, or if you'd like to listen to more episodes and view our show notes and resources, please visit us at thehealthcareleadershipexperience.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next week.